Today, instead of giving you a secret, I'm going to give you a book recommendation. And the book recommendation is The Subtle Art of Not Giving Up. And you guys can read
I
that.
have it.
What's that?
I have that book.
Have you read it?
Half of it. But
Okay.
Yeah, only read half of it.
Okay, so let me tell you about this book. First of all, the title really doesn't quite capture it. It's a book on how to think to make yourself more mentally healthy. Let's put it that way. It's interesting. My wife suggested it to me, and I read it. And I will tell you this: if you are sensitive to foul language, it's going to trigger you. But I'm also going to tell you that if you are sensitive to foul language, your entire life is going to be miserable because you're going to be surrounded, especially when you get out in the world of work. Oh my goodness. When I used to hang out with the mechanics from Unit 2 at the nuclear plant, woo! Right? Okay, so you get over that. You don't have to use that language yourself, but get used to being able to read it and listen to it without flipping out and having a heart attack. Anyway, the author's name is Mark Manson. I don't know if he's related to Charles Manson or not. You guys know who Charles Manson is? I'm pleased that at least you probably saw something on Netflix, right? That didn't even come out of your history class. Okay, someone over here said that they had read the book. Can you recommend this book?
Yeah.
Is it worth reading all the way through?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, did you notice that chapter 1 and chapter 2 have the F word a lot? And then it like trails off.
Mm-hmm.
And then right at the end he kind of picks it back up again. Now, it's like Game of Thrones. The first 2 seasons, lots of nudity, lots of sex, and then what happens?
Bait and switch.
Yeah, which explains why I've only seen 2 seasons. Okay. Any questions? Okay, let's get started. We are on chapter 12. We're talking about the risk, cost of capital, and capital budgeting. So the question is, what rate do we use? So far, we have just been telling you the appropriate rate to use. And it's like that rate was given down to you by the gods of finance, but in the real world, we've got to figure out that number for ourselves. So that's what chapter 12 is all about. We're trying to figure out what is the appropriate rate of return for whatever this thing is that we're looking at based on the riskiness of its cash flows. And so how are we going to determine this rate? Well, it turns out we have these magnificent laboratories for pricing risk. They're called the markets. In particular, we have the stock market and the bond market, and both of them do a really good job of telling us what the return is for a given level of riskiness. Okay, now, we said the stock markets and the bond markets tell us this. We know that most firms are financed by a mixture of equity and debt. By the way, can a firm be all equity? Yeah. In fact, if you're in biotechnology, you're almost 100% equity. Right? So a firm can be all equity. Can a firm be all debt? No. Somebody's got to own something, right? So there's got to be at least a little bit of equity in there. So what we're going to do is use that mixture of debt and equity to figure out what the firm's overall cost of capital is, and then we'll talk about how that relates to the individual little projects that firms may take on. Any questions so far? Okay. So let's talk about the cost of equity capital. Fortunately, we just finished up with chapter 6, and we said that there was we said there were 2 ways that we can figure out what the required return on equity are. We had that dividend growth model, and that's perfectly fine if a firm has constantly growing dividends. Do all firms pay dividends? No. So we have the other way that we can do this is through the capital asset pricing model, or what we call the security market line. That's where we use beta and the risk-free rate and the expected return of the market to figure out what a given stock should return based on its systematic risk. Which of those variables is the measurement of systematic risk? Beta. Very good. So we can actually do the security market line for any stock because we can figure out beta for any stock. but we can't always use the dividend discount model. Now, if I'm throwing stuff at you and you're trying to figure out what is the cost of equity capital, how do you know which one to use? Well, if I give you information about dividends and growth rates, then you're going to use that dividend growth model. If I give you the information about beta and the risk-free rate and the expected return on the market, you're going to use the security market line. Now, what if I give you enough information to solve both? What do you think you should do? Say again?
Whichever one you're more comfortable with?
Oh, comfort is not something we talk about in finance.
Do both.
Do both and take the average, right? Remember, these things are just swags. What does swag stand for? Yeah, scientific wild ass guess. And so if we've got two different pieces of information here, maybe we average them and we get closer to the truth. Will we hit the truth? No, but we're going to be closer to it. Okay. Any questions so far on how we're going to calculate the cost of equity capital? Okay, here's our security market line. Hopefully you guys remember this. It hasn't been that long ago, although I know you have been on spring break. What do we call that? Expected return on the market minus the risk-free rate. Yeah, the market risk premium. And so you always need to read to tell you whether you've been given the market risk premium or the expected return on the market. And the rest of that stuff should all be familiar to you. So what do we need to make this thing work? We need an estimate of the risk-free rate. We need an estimate of that market risk premium, and we need an estimate of the equity securities beta. So how are we going to figure out this risk-free rate? The standard throughout academia and industry is to use the annual yield on the 3-month U.S. Treasury bill. Now, are there shorter term Treasury bills? Yeah, you could have a 1-month Treasury bill, but here's the problem. They're not as liquid, they're not as, they don't get traded as often, they're not very popular. And so the 3-month is our absolute go-to for that. When you are working these problems, what you do is you look for the Treasury bill yield or the return on a Treasury bill and use that as your risk-free rate. Some of you will be solving these problems and you'll say, wait a minute, you didn't give me the risk-free rate. As soon as you say that, I want you to start thinking, I need to look for the Treasury bill yield. Questions? Oh, and by the way, where are we going to get that Treasury bill yield information? Any Federal Reserve Bank, there are 12 of them, but any of them, all of them, have that data freely available on their websites. So how are we going to estimate the market risk premium? Well, in the U.S., we typically use the S&P 500 as our proxy for the market portfolio. What's a proxy?
Like a stand-in?
Yeah, stand-in or a substitute. Now, is it perfect? Now, remember that the true market portfolio is every risky asset known to man held in proportion to its importance in the economy. And the S&P 500 is really only talking about 500 American stocks. But this is typically what we use when we're going to figure this out. Now, we can determine the historical return on the S&P 500 based on historical data. But here's the question. How many years of data should we use? Well, if you were just using 1 year's worth of data on the S&P 500 right now, you might not be thinking it was doing all that great. If you used 5 years, you might think it was doing far better. If you used 10 years, you know, it's just, so you have these different time frames and it's a judgment call as to which one you're going to use. Now, what would statisticians tell us to do? Anybody here a big statistics nerd? Nerd, tell me, do statisticians prefer smaller samples or larger samples? Oh yeah, the larger the better. And statisticians will tell you, hey, wait a minute, you schmucks have data on the S&P 500 going back to 1926. Why are we even having this discussion? Just throw all that stuff in the pot and cook it up. Let me explain to you why that's a bad idea. Roll yourself back to 1926. The United States is largely agricultural. Agricultural. Now, move forward, we have the Great Depression, and then what comes after the Great Depression? World War II. We have to become, and we were already somewhat industrial, but we have to become like mega industrial overnight. And so our economy changes to an industrial economy during World War II. And then, because we had bombed the living snot out of everyone else that had good industry during the war, where the Germans had done the same, we were basically the only industrial power left standing. So that led to this odd, weird prosperity of the 50s and the 60s. And so that's kind of weird. That's a different time. And then we switched, in the 80s, we switched from being an industrial economy to being what we called a service economy. And now I believe we're in what's called an information economy. I lose track of these things. But here's my question to you. Do you think the expected return on an agricultural economy is the same as the expected return on an information economy? No. And so you've got to keep these things in mind when you're making your choices. And then how do we find that market risk premium? Well, once we've done the historical return on the S&P 500, all we have to do is subtract out that risk-free rate from the return on the market portfolio, and that gives us our market risk premium. Where did we get the risk-free rate? Yeah, treasury bills. So, estimating beta, well, we know we can estimate it using linear regression. I showed you how to do that on Excel. But the problem is that betas tend to vary over time. And so we've got a similar problem that we had with finding the market risk premium, that is going to be different over different times. Do you think companies stay the same forever? No. I mean, you might look at someone like Coca-Cola, and for the most part, maybe they stay the same. But other companies, it's actually in their very nature to buy new companies and sell other companies. So before GE finally came apart, that was a business it was in. GE would buy into these new and upcoming industries, and as long as they could be number one or number two in that industry, they would stick with it. But then if they got to be something other than, they would sell that business. So for instance, I used to work with some people from GE Plastics. GE Plastics was, that's big and sexy stuff back in the 60s, but by the 1990s, it was becoming kind of also brand. And so they sold that to Saudi Arabia Basic Industries Corporation, or SABIC. So what does this tell us though? Over time, the composition of GE changes. What do you think happens to its beta? Yeah, it's going to fluctuate too. Okay, so on the one hand, we can think about using just the very most recent data in order to have fresh or current data, but then we ran into the problem Mr. Saba pointed out. We have a small sample size, or you can go with a long sample time period and get a greater sample size. However, you risk losing the currency of the estimate because after all, companies change over time. So let's take a look here at Microsoft. Hopefully you guys are all familiar with Microsoft. I remember when Microsoft went public. That's how old I am. I remember and at the time Microsoft was, it was groovy, it was high tech, it was where it was at, right? Now, when you start off and you are a new tech firm, what do you think your beta is going to look like? Yeah, it's going to be higher, right? It's definitely going to be higher. And so we see from 93 to 97, by the way, Microsoft went public way before that, but now we're just up to 93 to 97, and the beta is 1.28. Now, if we look forward for the next 5 years, we see the beta goes up to 1.75. By the way, what was happening during that 98 to 2002 time frame? Yeah, that's a dot-com boom and bust. So the beta was probably exaggerated during that time, but it was part of their history. Now, by the time we get to 2003, almost every single computer in the world, because Apple was on the ropes at that time, almost every single computer in the world is running on Windows. And how are we typing our term papers? Word. How are we doing our spreadsheets? Excel, right? And so basically, at this point, Microsoft has become more like a utility than like a tech company, right? And the beta kind of bears that out. Beta 0.86, and then 2008 to 2012, we see a beta of 0.98. So basically, Microsoft went from being the sexy, high-flying tech firm to being very boring. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is those dots. Those dots represent a pair of the return on the company versus the return on the market. And I want you to look at how well the blue line, which is how we get our beta, how well that blue line fits the data. Is that a great fit?
No.
No. In fact, do you guys know what a shotgun is? Yeah. Okay, so a rifle fires how many bullets? One. A shotgun shoots many, right? And if I took my shotgun out with, let's say, a bird shot. If I took my shotgun out with bird shot and I shot a piece of cardboard, it would look a whole lot like those data sets. And so what we're saying is something here that, especially in those ones on the left, they look a whole lot like shotgun blasts. And I can tell you also that one up top of 93 to 97, that's got a huge amount of influence on the slope of that line. If we were to take out that one, whoop, that line will change. And so we're back to this thing being a swag. And I want you to understand that our estimates of betas are swags. So when you do your math and you come out and you say, well, you know, this project needs to have a return of 7.09%. And you say, it returned 7.10%, so we should definitely take on that project. How accurate was that 7.09%? It's a swag, right? And now, looking at the picture, you know why it's a swag. And does it work better in some time periods than others? Yeah, if you look at those on the right, they seem to be a better fit. But look at the two on the right. The one on the top seems to have the slope right, but the points are further away from the line, right? The one on the bottom seems to be about the best one up there. Long story short, these are estimates and treat them accordingly, especially when you start to put down real money. You guys ever play poker for fake money?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you notice anything about your performance when you're playing for fake money versus real money?
You're riskier.
You're riskier, right? Because you're not playing with real money, but I tend to do better, right? If I start playing with real money, by the way, I've only gambled maybe $20 in my entire life, but, for shame, she's late. And she has a couple of mustache on it. I don't know what that's about. I hope there's no hairs in it. Okay, so on with the story. Where were we at before we were so rudely interrupted? Say again? Poker, yeah. Okay, so, and then once you start putting real money down, what happens? Yeah, you start losing. And that's why we have these, we have the Student Managed Investment Fund. Did you guys know that? And it's the Smith. Yeah, it sounds like someone with a speech impediment, right? So Smith, and it's real money. And for the longest time, I'm like, why would we use real money when we can just simulate this, right? But is it different when you've got real money on it? Yeah. And so when we're doing our exams, you can assume that the beta is correct, but when you start putting real money on these things, start thinking about how the fact that it's actually just a swag. Questions? Okay, so now our textbook makes the argument that in estimating beta, you can have your cake and eat it too. How can we do that? Well, instead of finding 5 years of data for our firm, let's find 1 year of data for our firm and 4 other firms that are doing exactly the same thing. And that way it will all be current, plus we'll have the sample size because we'll have all 5 firms. That sounds really great until you start actually looking at them. So let's start out with, in this case, Microsoft's beta is 1.17. Let's assume that we are a software company. Does Microsoft make software? Yeah. Is that the only thing it makes, though? No. Anybody here have an Xbox? Yeah, I figured it would be this the mustache crowd. Okay, so is Xbox software or hardware?
Hardware. hardware.
It's hardware. And that the system in Fords that you can talk to that will read your text messages to you, that's Microsoft. So that's hardware too. And so we're gonna have to throw Microsoft off the list because it's not a pure software company. Then we have Apple. Is Apple a software company? It does. They do iOS, right? They do Mac OS. So yeah, there's some software there. But Mr. Warren says no. What is Apple primarily?
Hardware.
Yeah, primarily hardware, right? In fact, the only reason Apple does their own software is so their hardware won't suck. That make sense? You start depending on other people and then you get in trouble. Okay, now, so that means we toss Apple off the list. This argument is starting to fall apart for them about being able to find all these companies. Now, what about automatic data processing, or ADP? What do you think they do?
That's software.
Software, okay, do you know what they do?
I used ADP when I worked in HR.
Okay, and what did they do for you?
That was our HRIS system that we used for everything from processing payroll to benefits to anything under the sun.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is what ADP does. ADP, now, do they have software? Yes, they use software to do all this stuff. But is that actually their product? They're the ones that are actually moving the money around, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they had access to your checking account, and they would pull out and they would send money to the employee's checking account. They would send money to the federal government. They would send money to the state government, union dues, insurance, you name it. So it's actually more of a business services firm. By the way, this isn't exactly on point, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. When I worked for the last real job that I had, ADP did our payroll, and the checks would come in a FedEx box on Friday. And we all knew when it was going to come. And there we were up against the window waiting for the FedEx man, right? Because that's the paycheck was coming. Now, let me ask you this. If the paychecks come in, should you allow your assistant to hand them out, or should you hand them out yourself? Yourself, why?
Independence.
Say again.
Independence. It's independence. So,
Independence? Please explain.
Well, I mean, clip your eyes.
Oh, okay, now he's getting it. Okay, so here's the trick. This happened to me in Dallas, Texas. The checks come in, and my right-hand man, Carl, he's like, hey, you want me to hand the checks out? I'm like, yeah, sure. And as soon as he walks off, the three other production group leaders, their mouths drop open. These are all guys about my age now, right? And they're like, what the hell are you doing, man? I said, what? And he said, no. You always hand out the checks. These people need to know that everything good in their life comes from your hand. And that the hand that can give can also take away, right? Does that make sense? Is that terrible? Are people scumbags? Yeah. And so it's scumbaggy on the supervisor's part, but knowing that the employees are also scumbags, it's kind of necessary. Okay, on with the story. Oracle, what do they do?
They kind of got more like healthcare software.
Yeah, they're big into databases are the big thing, right? But I remember actually back when Oracle bought Sun Microsystems. Sun Microsystems, you guys probably know them as Java. I actually used Sun Microsystems CAD scopes when I was in engineering school. So once again, we're gonna have to say, not quite, we're gonna have to throw them out. Computer sciences, what they do is they buy up, it's either them or Computer Associates, the next one down. They buy up the licenses for these old mainframe programs. By the way, do you guys know what a mainframe is? Way back in the dark ages, it was all one big computer, and that was the mainframe. Then it filled up a room, and there was air conditioning and whatnot to keep it from overheating. And then all the terminals that you saw were actually connected to it through wires, but they were dumb terminals. There was no computing power in them. And this is the way it was when I went to the nuclear plant in 1991. And strangely enough, today, if you go into Bass Pro Shop, anybody here ever been to the Bass Pro Shop? When you're going through checkout and they ask you about your frequent flyer card, whatever it is, their reward card, and they go to look it up if you don't have it with you, which I never do, and they put in your phone number, that screen that you can see, that's mainframe. Those blue letters on the background, on the black background, that's an AS400 emulator. That's mainframe stuff. Now, undoubtedly, the person that wrote that program is dead. Why? Because that's just the way it works, right? Humans live, they become professionally productive, and then eventually they die. So whoever wrote, my Uncle Elwin was a green screener, and he's dead. So, long story short, who's there to support that stuff? Nobody. And so that's the business of, and I forget which one it is, Computer Sciences or Computer Associates, but long story short, is that software? No, that's more like tech support, right? So we're gonna scratch them off the list too. Then we're on down to Fiserv. And Fiserv writes software for banks. Does that sound like a software company? Yeah. Except for one thing, they also process credit card transactions. So are they a pure software company? Nope, so whoop, off the list they go. Then we're on to Accenture. Accenture is a consulting company that helps you install other people's software. For instance, if you wanted to install SAP, you guys know what SAP is? It's a big enterprise resource planning program. It's German, and in fact, when we installed it in 1999, and we go to the help screens were in German, which didn't help us a whole lot. Anyway, long story short, SAP, we did not install that ourselves. We had a consultant similar to Accenture help us to do that. Are they truly a software company? No, they're installing other people's software, so we're going to scratch them. Then we get down to Symantec. What does Symantec do? I'll give you another hint. Norton.
Antivirus.
Yeah, antivirus. Now, it turns out Symantec is truly a pure play software company. Finally, what we've been looking for, except for one thing. Do you think people might buy Symantec's product when they're not buying other software? If you could only update one piece of software on your computer, what would it be?
Security.
Yeah, it's gonna be that antivirus, right? Man, I could still be using Microsoft Word 2003, and I probably wouldn't miss a beat, right? Do you think there have been new Trojans and viruses and whatnot come along since 2003? Oh, hell yes. And so you notice their beta is below 1. Why is that? Because people will pay to keep viruses off their computers, even during bad times. By the way, so they're off the list. Because they don't, unless we're doing antivirus software too, they're off the list. What about Paychex Inc? What do you think, just knowing nothing but their name, what do you think they do? Payroll, yeah. So they're basically like a competitor to ADP, and we know that we had to throw them off the list, so whoop, throw that off there. What happens to this argument about finding other companies doing exactly the same thing and taking the average of all their like last year betas? It's crap. It's crap, so don't fall for that. Questions?
So this work for like utility companies or whatnot? Or-
Yeah, so if you were an electric utility and that was all that you did, then perhaps you could do this. Now let me ask you this. Here in Springfield, City Utilities is bringing us, they're not publicly traded, but just assume they are. What all do they do? Do they just do electric? No, they do electric, water, and gas. By the way, the water is out in my neighborhood. Oh yeah. My wife was like, wow, I'm so glad we got our showers in. Well, so it's still safe to come to my office for office hours. But, yeah, it's back. Now, do you know what mix of electric, water, and gas they have? No. So if you've got utilities that do more than one thing, then we get back to the conglomerate argument where, you know, if the proportions are different, then we can't really figure it out. What if you had people who are purely doing electricity? For instance, I think Ameren purely does electricity. Then that might be a good argument. Other questions? Okay. Now let's talk about business cyclicality and beta. And we're going to end up throwing a bunch on the board here, so I'm going to erase. Did everybody get this title of this book down? I'm going to erase it here. Okay, so everything starts with the business cycle. Can anybody tell me what the business cycle is? if the economy improves, do you think that might change sales at some companies? Yeah. And so, and it also works the other way. There are products that sell worse in bad times. And so anything that has improved sales during good times, we call cyclical or pro-cyclical. Anything that does better during good times is cyclical or pro-cyclical. If it does it the other way, it's counter-cyclical or anti-cyclical, so it's going the other way. Now, let's talk about some things that are cyclical and counter-cyclical. What about luxury automobiles? Cyclical. What about cheap liquor? Yeah, anti-cyclical, counter-cyclical. And so we can see that the business cycle affects all of those. Now, there are some things that are not really affected by the business cycle. For instance, water consumption, electrical consumption. Maybe, well, I started to say maybe chicken, but chicken actually does maybe a little bit better when times are hard because it's cheaper. Okay, now the cyclicality is going to impact the sales of the firm. Actually, let's do this another way. Let's call this the economy. And the economy is going to impact sales through this business cyclicality, either up or down. Now, at the same time, what's going on with the economy and the market? What's the general idea? If the market's doing well, then the market is... If the economy's doing well, what happens in the stock market? It goes up. That's in general. No, it's the engine. Okay, so we can see, and we'll go ahead and call this market return. So if the economy is going up, market return is going up, then we'll also, we're going to use a pro-cyclical firm here. So we're going to say as the economy goes up, that sales go up. Now, you got to be careful here because cyclicality and volatility are not necessarily the same thing. So if I am selling luxury automobiles and the economy does better, my sales go up, the economy does worse, my sales goes down. That's cyclicality. But let's talk about the profits or the sales at a movie studio. Any of you seen Snow White, the new one?
Yeah.
Was it any good?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so here's how the revenues at movie studios work. Do you think that they're up during good economic times and down during bad economic times? No, it totally depends on whether they turn out something good or they turn out stinkers, right? And so when they do something good, their sales go up. When they put out a stinker, their sales go down. That's volatility. That's volatility. That is not cyclicality. And so don't be confused by that. Okay, now, any questions so far? Now, let's talk about the next thing that's going to impact our returns on the stock. And we're going to say that increased sales increases profit. Does that make sense? Okay. Increased sales means increased profit, and the thing that moderates this relationship is called the operating leverage. Now, what in the world is operating leverage? It's basically the sensitivity of the change in profit to the change in sales. And you may see this thing written down in many different ways. Sometimes people will use net income, which is an accounting profit measure. Sometimes they'll use EBIT to back out depreciation and capital structure stuff. Sometimes they'll go with operating cash flows, which you guys learned about in chapter 2. Long story short, it's always the change in the profit divided by the change in sales. And so if I've got a firm with an operating leverage of 3, what that means is sales go up 10%, my profit's going to go up 30%. If I have a firm with an operating leverage of 6, when sales go up 10%, my profits go up 60%. Now, so far, it sounds really great. Woo, I want all the operating leverage I can get, except for one thing. What's the problem?
Well, they go down, bad.
Yeah, when sales go down, the higher your operating leverage is, the more your sales go, or the more your profit goes down for the same decrease in sales. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's talk about what goes into determining operating leverage. In firms, we have 2 basic kinds of costs. We have fixed costs and we have, what's the other one? Variable costs. Your variable costs will be things like labor, raw materials, the things that you have to spend to produce a unit of whatever it is you're producing. But then there are other costs that go on regardless of how many units you sell. For instance, in this building, the lights are all on, even though maybe we only have half as many seated students as we used to. By the way, that's because people have started going online, right? But you made the right call being here since you're in town, right? Okay, so that cost of that electricity stays the same, regardless of how many students we have in the building, how many units we produce. Now, what causes this operating leverage? It's the comparative amounts of those 2 things. If I have a firm that has 100% variable costs and no fixed costs whatsoever, and I'll give you an example here in a minute, then my operating leverage is going to be exactly 1. And your operating leverage will never be less than 1. Let me say that again. Your operating leverage will never be less than 1. Now let's talk about a firm that has no fixed costs. Any of you guys ever watch the show How It's Made?
Yeah, I love that.
You're Canadian. You're supposed to love that show. Oh, okay, I love it too. Okay, so I was watching this, and they're like, next on How It's Made, Swiss leather luxury watch bands. I'm like, ooh, this sounds like some crazy stuff. They're going to be in a laboratory, and they're going to have some complicated machines. No, it was some dude at his kitchen table with a block of wood, a hammer, some tools, some glue, and a needle, and he was making these things by hand. Now, what are his fixed costs? 0, basically. Was he going to have the kitchen table anyway? Yeah, probably found that block of wood out in the trees when he was bringing in the cows. You know, who knows? But long story short, his fixed costs were really, really low. So we'll say his operating leverage is 1, because that's the lowest it can ever be. Now, his wife, by the way, it's a common conversation. His wife says, "We need 10% more money." It's actually usually 20. We need 10% more money. How does that guy bring in 10% more money? What does he have to do? He's got to make what percentage more watch bands? 10% more, right? Because his operating leverage is 1. Okay, now, several episodes later, they're in a Chinese factory where they're making watch bands. And it's quite different because there are like 2 dudes over here and they're grabbing these cowhides that still have the hair on them, and they're throwing them into this machine, and it goes bzz, 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 it shoots out watch bands on the other end, and there's a guy there with a box catching the watch bands, right? What are the fixed costs there? Small or big? They're big, right? Because you got to have a factory. Did the Swiss dude have a factory? No. And by the way, that machine, if we're in accounting world, that's got a depreciation. And there's all sorts of things that have high fixed costs there. What were their variable costs compared to Swiss dude? Quite low, right? Quite low. And so that firm would have a higher operating leverage. In good times, that firm would be doing far better than the Swiss dude. In bad times, they would be doing far worse. I'm gonna give you one more example of this difference in fixed and variable costs. If I say to you, Japanese car factory, do you see more in your mind, more people or robots? Robots, and that's exactly what I thought until 1999 when I visited a Honda plant in Ohio, and I was amazed. They were making Honda Civics, and the Honda Civics were coming down the line, and there were just people swarming all over these cars like bees. Like, wow, that's amazing. I did not expect it. And the process, you'd think it would be you would think that almost every Honda that came off the line was perfect the first time. Wrong. It was around 65, 66% were right the first time. And the ones that weren't got pulled over to the side. And it was so funny to watch this guy fixing the trunk alignment. Big old guy, and he goes, I'm not kidding. The man was bending the car with his hands. So what am I telling you here? Were they using these high-tech, high fixed cost methods? No, they weren't, because their labor was relatively cheap compared to Japan. If you went to Japan in a Honda factory, you would see more robots. Now, let's move over to a General Motors factory that's in the same state. And in fact, it's shut down now, Lordstown. And that same kind of idea, in fact, they were making cars for the same market, and yet General Motors has a lot more robots and a lot fewer people. Why do you think that is?
Their cost of labor is gonna be relatively higher compared to what it's.
Yeah, the cost of labor at General Motors is relatively higher. Why? Yeah, it's a union shop, right? The UAW. You know, you can't get your kids into medical school, at least get them a job at Chrysler, Sherwin-Williams on the 300, right? Those people, those union workers get paid a lot. Now, what does that mean? It means it is more economically feasible for GM to employ automation. Honda, their people are cheap. Why would they bother to put in robots that will cost them more than the people? But GM, because their people are more expensive, it makes sense to go ahead and put in robots instead of people. How do we see this in our economy today? If you look at fast food restaurants, what's everyone's clamoring for these high wages for fast food workers. Now, what have McDonald's and Taco Bell done in response to that? Yeah, a lot more automation, man. When you walk into a McDonald's now or a Taco Bell, in fact, they built a Taco Bell down just south of my house, and when you walk in there, there's really no way to order at the counter. It's all kiosk, right? Of course, it keeps old people away, but it's all kiosk. Why? How can they afford to put these kiosks in? Those are pretty expensive looking things.
It's cheaper than the people.
It's cheaper than the people. And now we've got this burger flipping robot called Flippy. Have you seen this? By the way, nobody wants to flip burgers. This is a good job to get rid of, right? Okay, now let's get back to this. Let's think about Honda and General Motors. Most manufacturing operations are, typically we have 3 shifts, right? You've got your day shift, your evening shift, and then your graveyard or the overnight shift. And typically, most of the time, you run 2 shifts. So let's say both Honda and General Motors are running 2 shifts. At Honda, you have to have 5,000 people per shift. At General Motors, you have to have 12 people per shift just to go around and take care of the robots. Of course, I'm exaggerating the number here, but it's much smaller than the Honda number. Now, at General Motors, let's assume that times get really good and you want to start building more cars. Well, the easy answer is to add a 3rd shift. General Motors, when they add a 3rd shift, all they have to do is hire 12 people. What does Honda have to do? They have to go out and hire 5,000 people. Now, the sales go up the same amount at both companies, but the profit goes up more at General Motors because they didn't have to raise their variable costs as much when they added that 3rd shift. So right now it seems like you want to be in General Motors' shoes until the financial crisis happens. Then what happens? By the way, when you are driving a car and a financial crisis hits, as long as your car is still getting you to work, what do you do? You keep it, right? Everybody hunkers down. I drove my Nissan Sentra for 12 years, right? Everybody hunkers down and just waits. What does that do to car sales? Whoop. So now they have to get rid of the third shift. General Motors is able to get rid of a grand total of 12 people. What happens at Honda? Yeah, so they're able to cut their costs a lot more than General Motors. So when times are bad, it's better to have a lower operating leverage. When times are good, it's better to have a higher operating leverage. Okay, so now we understand how changes in the economy get translated into changes in sales through business cyclicality, and how changes in sales get translated into changes in profit through operating leverage. Now we're going to have to see how this how financial leverage is going to come into work here. If you remember, we talked about the equity multiplier at the firm being total assets over total equity. You guys remember that? We said this is a measure of leverage. The higher this number is, the higher your financial leverage. If I have a firm that is all equity, what's my financial, or what's my equity multiplier? Yeah, it's 1, right? And so the equity multiplier is just like operating leverage in that 1 is the lowest it will ever be. 1 is the lowest it will ever be. But if I start to add debt in here, then that equity multiplier gets to be greater than 1. And let's just give you an example here. We've got our ROA is equal, let's see, ROE is equal to ROA times the equity multiplier. So that ROE starts to climb away from the ROA the more debt I had in the capital structure. Have I lost anybody yet? Yes? Was that a no? You just coughed?
Yeah, I just
Okay,
coughed.
she just coughed. Asian ladies have such quiet, small coughs. And I say, go ahead and let all that out, otherwise you might explode. I know from personal experience, it's not pleasant. Okay, back to the story. So, how are we going to translate this profit into shareholder returns? It's going to be through the financial leverage. We're going to take this overall profitability at the firm, and then the more leverage you've got, the more of that flows to the shareholders. So it magnifies, just like this right here. The return on the equity is equal to the return on the assets times the equity multiplier. So the more debt in the capital structure, the more magnified these returns are to the shareholders. Okay, now, do you see that we can now have a relationship here between market return and shareholder returns? What was our measure of systematic risk for firms? The beta. And so this is going to be the beta on the equity is what links these two things. That's the beta on the equity. Now it turns out that we can link these two things by what we're going to call the beta of the assets. So the beta of the assets is the risk of the underlying assets. The beta of the assets, the risk of the underlying assets. Now, I can take any firm and by adding debt to its capital structure, make the equity riskier than the assets. If there's no debt whatsoever, then the beta of the equity is equal to the beta of the assets, are identically risky. But as soon as I start putting debt into that capital structure, then the shares become riskier than the underlying assets. Why is it riskier to be the owner of a firm with debt than one with no debt?
That's what we pay.
Say again?
That's a repeated it.
Yeah, we have to repay the debt. So I'll give you an example here of the riskiness involved with debt. And I'll use households for an example. I had this neighbor who was a spine surgeon. He still is. I had a neighbor who's a spine surgeon. And basically, he got paid by the spine, right? He would complain that Mercy wasn't throwing him enough spines. Now, I, on the other hand, have this nice job here at the university, and so does my wife. And we have very stable income. Also, a difference between us and him is he went through medical school and took on a lot of student debt. Furthermore, his house is probably $100,000 more than mine because he's got a basement. And beyond that, he drives a BMW M5. Now, how much debt do you think the man has? He's in debt to his eyeballs. He's in debt to his eyeballs to the point that if he misses a spine, he might miss some of his payments. Now, what about my wife and I on the other hand? We've got the constant cash flow in, that's pretty cool, but we also have much lower debt. We only owe like $170,000 at this point. Why? Because when you go to PhD school instead of med school, they pay you instead of you paying them. Isn't that cool? Plus I don't have to stick my finger in anyone's butt. And I view that as a big old benefit to being this kind of doctor and not that kind of doctor, right? Okay, long story short, the more debt you are in, the riskier your situation is. And who is the residual claimant at the firm? The common shareholders. Okay, so that's why financial leverage increases this risk. So, of course, everything has to be expressed as an equation. And here we go, the beta of the asset, which is this thing right here. The beta of the asset is equal to a weighted average of the beta on the equity and the beta on the debt. Now, a weighted average, we've got these weights here. What do you think E stands for? Equity. What do you think D stands for? Debt. And if I add debt and equity together, what do I get? Assets. We get the total assets. And so basically, that first weight that you see there, E over D plus E, is the proportion of the capital structure financed with equity. The second one that you see, D over D plus E, is the proportion of the capital structure financed with debt. Now, what do we know about weights? What do they have to add up to? 1, right? Now, if I take the first one and add the second one, I get E plus D over D plus E. What does that boil down to? 1, right? So everything checks out. Okay, now we have talked in this class a lot about beta of the equity. Have we talked much about beta of debt? No, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a little bit. Now, you need to have this equation on your note sheet. And you need to use this equation if I give you the beta of debt. Let me say that again. You need to use this equation if I give you the beta of debt. You need to use this equation if I give you the beta of debt. But most of the time, we just make a common assumption that the beta of the debt is 0. And here's why we say the beta of the debt is 0, or at least close enough that we can assume that. So if you think about it, the economy goes up, the stock price goes up, times are bad, the stock price goes down. So we see a lot of fluctuation with the equity. But what do we see with the debt? Times are good, they pay the coupon. Times are bad, they pay the coupon. Times are okay, they pay the coupon. Times are extraordinarily good. What happens? They pay the coupon. Do you see that the cash flows on the bonds, unless they default, the cash flows on the bonds are largely unrelated to this underlying economic activity. And as a result, we can assume that beta of debt is 0 unless we are told otherwise. Let me say that again, beta of debt is 0 unless we are told otherwise. Now, when I throw that beta of debt as 0 into that equation, it gets rid of that whole second term. It gets rid of the whole second term. And then we can rearrange this thing so that we can determine the beta of the equity based on the risk of the underlying asset and the leverage. So here we go. I'm going to rearrange that, and I'll say the beta of the asset is equal to, okay, so that's our equation before we rearrange it. And then I'm going to multiply both sides by E plus D over E. And when I do that, I get that the beta of the equity is equal to E plus D over E times the beta of the assets. Now, E plus D over E plus D is just the total assets, right? And so what we're really looking at here is that this is the equity multiplier times the beta of the assets. The equity multiplier times the beta of the assets. And what is the relationship between the debt to equity ratio and the equity multiplier? Yeah, 1 plus the debt to equity ratio is the equity multiplier. And we can see that here in this formula. It's 1 plus the debt to equity ratio multiplied by the beta of the assets. So if I look at this formula and ask you what is the impact of increased debt on the beta of the equity, if I increase debt, it means that debt to equity ratio is going to be greater. It means that coefficient is going to be greater, and so the beta of the equity is going to be greater. By the way, what's the debt to equity ratio for a firm with no debt? 0, right? 0. Okay. You can only use this formula when the beta of debt is 0. You can only use this formula when the beta of debt is 0. Okay, so all that was giving you a little more background on the security market line and where beta comes from. Now we're going to talk about the dividend discount model. This is our other way that we're going to estimate it. And remember, you can either estimate G using the retention ratio or plowback ratio, which is B, multiplied by the return on equity. What's the relationship between the plowback ratio and the dividend payout ratio? Yeah, 1 minus, right? If I give you 1, you can take 1 minus that thing and get the other one. The problem is this does not work for firms without dividends that are growing at a constant rate. And I'm going to tell you that is most firms. In fact, there's only a small subset of firms that we could even closely approximate using this dividend discount model. Why do we teach you the dividend discount model? So you'll understand the relationships between capital gains, dividend growth, and the required return. We only had 1 slide on that. We had a bunch of slides on the other thing. What do you think is more likely to show up in testing material? Yeah, the other thing, because there's more stuff, right? Now, the cost of debt. We've talked about the cost of equity. I told you 2 ways to find that. Now we're going to talk about the cost of debt. And it turns out that the cost of debt is just the yield to maturity on the firm's publicly traded bonds. The yield to maturity on the firm's publicly traded bonds. And if we only have 1 bond issue outstanding, it's really easy to figure out what is the required return on the firm's debt. It's just the yield to maturity on that 1 bond issue. But what if we have multiple issues outstanding? Then the way we're going to find this is the yield to maturity, or the cost of debt for the firm, is a weighted average. I know there's nothing that students hate more in this world than a weighted average, but whoop, here we go, right? So let's talk about, we've got different bond issues. We've got bond issue A, and with B and C. We're going to start with the number of bonds. This one's got 100 bonds, this one's got 1,000 bonds, and this one's got 10 bonds. This is the bond price. This one is trading for 1,000, what would we call that bond? What kind of bond is it? Par bond. Okay, this one is trading for $950. What would we call that? Discount bond. And this one is trading at $1,050. What would we call that? Premium bond. Okay, now what I want to do is figure out the market value for each issue. The market value for each issue is just going to be the number of bonds times the price per bond. This is per bond. What's 100 times 1,000? I believe it's 100,000. Over here, I think we've got 950,000. And then over here, I think we've got 10,500. Does my math check out? Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is figure out what is the total value of the firm's bonds outstanding. I want to figure out the total value of the bonds outstanding. Yeah, I'm just going to add 100,000, 950,000. I believe that brings me to 1.05 million. And this is going to bring me up to, I got to write this down, 1 point. Let's see. So that's, okay, so this is 1,050,000, is that right? When I add those two together? Then I add 10,500, so I should be at 1,060,500, is that right?
Yes.
Very good, okay. Whew. Now, I'm going to figure out the weight for each issue. And the weight for this one is going to be 100,000 divided by 1,060,500. This one's going to be, what's this one going to be?
950.
Yeah, 950,000 divided by 1,060,500. And then this last one's going to be 10,500 divided by 1,060,500. Okay, so those are the weights. I'm not going to go ahead and calculate those out. But here's what's going to happen next. We're going to ask, well, what's the yield to maturity on all these? I'm going to have 6%, 7%, 5%. And how am I going to find these, the weighted average? I'm going to take this weight times this number, add this weight times this number, and add this weight times this number. So if I were you, what I would do is do each one of these calculations separately, store 1, store 2, store 3, and then add them all together, and that will give you your weighted average for the yield to maturity for all of the firm's bond issues. That is the before tax cost of debt for the firm. The before tax cost of debt for the firm is the weighted average yield to maturity for all the firm's bond issues. Now, why do I say before tax? Because interest is tax deductible. Are we really spending this much money? No, we're going to end up, because we save money on our taxes because of interest, our true cost, our after-tax cost of interest is going to be lower. Questions so far? Okay, now, one thing to note. If you think back to chapter 4, we talked about how when you have compounding within the year, that your effective annual rate is not the same as your APR. So this yield to maturity is an APR. And as long as the bonds are only paying one coupon per year, yield to maturity is exactly the same as the effective annual rate. But how often do most bonds pay? Twice per year. So that means the effective annual rate of the cost of this debt is actually going to be somewhat higher because of that compounding within the period. Theoretically, I believe that we should be using the effective annual rate, not the yield to maturity. But I came into this rather late in the game. And powers that be have already decided that we are going to use yield to maturity, damn it. And so that's what's in the textbook, and that's how the exams will be, and that's how you will live your life going forward, because otherwise people will tell you shouldn't listen to crazy professors who obviously don't know what they're talking about, right? Okay, yield to maturity, that's our before tax cost of debt. So now we're going to talk about the weighted average cost of capital at the firm. We have talked about the required return on equity. What were the two ways we could get the return on equity?
After discount.
Say again?
After discount.
Yeah, the capital asset pricing model or the security market line. What was the other way? Dividend growth model, right? And then for the cost of debt, we just figured out it is equal to what? Give me a hint, 3 letters. Yield to maturity, the weighted average yield to maturity for all the bond issues. If there's only one bond outstanding, you're lucky. That's all you have to deal with. By the way, do you think I might give you all sorts of information for you to figure out the yield to maturity on the bond, and then give you all sorts of information for you to figure out what the required return is on the stock, and then make you take those ingredients, put them together, and then do this thing? Oh yeah. When you see that problem, what should you do with it? Skip it, right? Come back to it when you're done. Okay, so here we go. The weighted average cost of capital, by the way, you'll probably recognize the weights. They're the same weights that we used earlier when we were talking about the beta of the assets, the beta of the debt, and the beta of the equity. They're the same weights. It's the proportion of the capital structure that is equity. We're going to multiply that by the required return on equity. That sounds perfectly fine so far from a weighted average kind of perspective. And you might expect the other one will be, hey, it's just going to be the proportion of debt in the capital structure multiplied by the yield to maturity, that weighted average yield to maturity. And it would be, except for one thing. Interest is tax deductible. Interest is tax deductible. And so I don't have to do it on the equity, because equity, cost of equity is not tax deductible, the cost of debt is. So I'm going to multiply that second term by 1 minus T sub C. What do you think T sub C stands for? Yeah, it's the corporate tax rate. By the way, do you think it's the average tax rate or the marginal tax rate? Marginal, because it's the very next dollar, because we're trying to figure out whether or not we're going to take on a project. That project is going to introduce another dollar to us, and so there we go. Do you think this should be on your, yeah, it should be on your note sheet. I used to make a joke here. Do you guys know who Whitney Houston is? What did Whitney Houston say about crack? Yeah, time has gone, too much time's gone on. Whitney Houston in an interview said, crack is whack. I'm telling you, this is a different kind of whack. I gotta stop telling that joke because it was good 20 years ago, but not now. Okay, so here we go. Let's do a whack example. Man, this example is whack. Okay, so our firm is financed 2/3 debt and 1/3 equity. By the way, if I add 2/3 and 1/3 together, what do I get? 1. Always got to be that way. The required return on the equity is 15%. The required return on the debt, that's before tax. In fact, unless I tell you otherwise, the required returns on debt that I give you are always before tax. Unless I tell you otherwise, the required returns I give you are always before tax. That's how we observe them out in the wild. When we're looking at the yield to maturities for bonds, those are all before tax numbers. The only way it is not is if I specifically say the after-tax return is, or the after-tax cost of debt is. If I say that, then you know. Otherwise, you always assume it's before tax. So the before tax cost of debt is 12%. Corporate tax rate is 25%. So I've got that first weight is 1/3. I'm going to multiply it by the required return on equity. What is 1/3 of 15%? 5%. I should hope you can do that in your heads. Okay, now the next thing is we're going to take 2/3 the other way to multiply it by 12%. That's our before tax cost of debt. And then multiply by 1 minus 0.25. What is 2/3 of 12%? 8%. right? What's 8% times 0.75? What's 3/4 of 8? 6, right? 6%. And so we're gonna take 5% plus 6%, and that tells us that our weighted average cost of capital for this firm is 11%. Is it more complicated when you're working a problem? Yeah, because I probably am gonna tell you how many shares are outstanding, what the price of each share is. You're gonna have to multiply those two things to get E. And I'm gonna tell you how many bonds are outstanding, the price on those bonds, and you're gonna have to multiply those two together to get D. Then you're gonna have to add E and D together to get the bottom number, right? So there's gonna be a lot more work than just this. This is a very simple example. Now let's talk about more or less risky projects. Remember that the price or value of anything is the present value of all the expected future cash flows discounted at a rate appropriate to the risk. The riskier something is, the higher the return must be. Now, if I have a project that is exactly as risky as the rest of the firm, it is absolutely fine to use the weighted average cost of capital as a discount rate for that project. If I have a project that's identically as risky as everything else at the firm, it's perfectly fine to use the WACC. For example, there is a car company called Nissan. You guys know Nissan? Nissan makes this car, or they used to. I think maybe they stopped. It's called the Altima. You guys know about the Nissan Altima? Now that is a boring ass car. I should know I had one, right? This is the kind of cars that kindergarten teachers buy when they get their first job after school, after college. Now, why is this a boring car? It's a known product in a known market segment. It uses known technology. It has a sales history. There's all sorts of things that make me think the Nissan Altima is basically just as boring as the rest of Nissan. Now, knowing that, if I were going to go out and build another factory for the Nissan Altima, it would be perfectly fine for me to use the weighted average cost of capital as my discount rate for that factory. But what if I were going to go out and build a factory to build the Nissan Ariya? Do you guys know what the Ariya is? Yeah, it's electric. And by the way, the fact that only one of you actually knew it tells me that the Ariya has not been an overwhelming commercial success. Okay. So let's talk about the Nissan Ariya and why the risk would be different. Number one, different, it's a market that hasn't been proven out yet, right? And you say, wait a minute, we have electric car sales numbers. We have electric car sales numbers that have been inflated by government incentives, right? Because when they're saying, oh, we'll give you $7,500 if you buy one of these things, that kind of distorts the market. So we don't have true numbers. By the way, are those government incentives going to last forever? No, they very definitely should not. Anyway, so we can't count on that. So we don't have real numbers. Also, the technology. Do you think electric car technology is riskier than? Oh yeah. So let's think about how this works. Where is the energy in a gasoline-powered automobile stored? In the gas tank. This is important. It's in the gas tank, right? Now, in an electric car, oh, by the way, where's the gas tank? It's back behind it, right? Now, where's the energy stored in an electric car? The battery. Where's the battery typically located? Underneath. And here's why. And I can tell you this as a mechanical engineer, right? The lower the center of gravity for an automobile, the better it handles. And so you're like, hot damn, as a mechanical engineer, I'm like, I've got this huge weight I can hang directly underneath the vehicle. Lower that, man, that thing will corner like it's on rails. What's the problem? Yeah! Yeah, so these things have a tendency to catch on fire. So there you are, sitting on top of the battery catches fire. Talk about your chestnuts roasting in an open fire. This is risky, right? Now, if we were trying to figure out the rate that we need to use for the Nissan Aria plant, should we use the weighted average cost of capital? Absolutely not. And next time, we'll talk about what we're going to do instead.